Good afternoon, graduate students of transpersonal psychology. I am going to deliver the presentation that I had uh, promised regarding the final presentation. So what I'm going to do here is, first of all, just briefly go over the syllabus. And as I remember, the completion date is for in 2 weeks. That is, I think it's on the 22nd of March, so Sunday in 2 weeks, the 22nd of March. So let's go over these guidelines as well as the syllabus here. And so you'll see here it says a week 8, March 15th. This is really based upon when you might have started it, but in the on Canvas it does say March 22nd. So don't freak out by seeing that March 15th number. Furthermore, I got to say, if you are just a few days late on that, and I don't mean a few days meaning 7 days, I mean a few days meaning 2, 3, 4 days, that's fine. But here, let's go over what some of this is. So it says create a PowerPoint. So you're going to do is you're going to create a PowerPoint presentation, and it says briefly your research must be quantitative. This is a quantitative research methods course. It has to be quantitative. That's what we're working on, and this is what we've been moving toward from the beginning through chapter 6. Then we're going to use random selection and assignment in the proposal. So remember, now you're actually not doing this. This is a proposal, and in some cases might even be a mock project. So quantitative, random selection, pre-test, post-test, and control group. And remember that the 3 hallmarks of an experiment are, in fact, a pre-test, at least a pre-test and a post-test, a control group, and random assignment. Now, beyond that, we then get into implementing other types of control procedures in order to ascertain whether or not there are other confounds that were affecting the result. And remember that the whole point of research, the whole point of any experiment, is to demonstrate cause and effect. Does manipulating the independent variable cause a change in the dependent variable? And if so, how? By what medium? By what mechanism? How does that happen? So we want to examine not only a correlation, or in other words, does A affect B, but how does it affect B? And this is where I think some of us are maybe missing it, in that we see, or we've understood, or we have a belief that the independent variable changes the dependent variable, that in fact there's some sort of a causative agent there, but we're missing how that causative agent travels, through what medium or what process does it events itself. So with that in mind, the research is going to be that. And here's the guideline I've got here for your presentation. So first of all, an abstract, no more than 2 or 3 paragraphs summarizing your research. So by now, being the astute graduate students that you are, most of you, if not all of you, understand what an abstract is, and understand how to, if you're not quite sure how to create or write a pithy abstract that summarizes the research, or at least your idea. And of course, that would summarize your introduction, your methods, your results, and your conclusion. And it's going to do that in no more than 2 or 3 paragraphs. In fact, I think the APA standard is no more than 250 words. And then in your presentation, you'll have an introduction. What does any introduction in a scientific article have? And by scientific article, I mean not only a psychological, not only in behavioral sciences, but in the physical sciences as well. It follows the same format every single time. A statement of the problem, a statement of whatever causal relationships may be there, the statement of your constructs, literature citations regarding the background and substantiation for what you're going to do, and how what you're going to do is either a replication, if it is a replication, and if it is not, then what else does it do that the previous research didn't do, but replications are just fine. And then a statement of your hypothesis or hypotheses. Most projects have more than one hypothesis. So you follow all of this into the methods. And now, so this introduction substantiates what you're going to do, gives reasons why, and then goes further into exploring what other research has been done in this general area that you're proposing. Then we move on to the methods. Now, the methods has multiple sections that are all important. The first thing you're going to discuss is your sampling procedure. Now, in most cases, I'd say almost in all cases, the selection process, that is the process of selecting participants from a population, is one thing. It is very rarely, if ever, random. However, your assignment procedures should and must be totally random. So in this case, you're going to talk about selecting whoever your study, the participants of your study, and then how you then assign those participants to any one of two or more groups, of course, where one of them must be a control group. Then the sample description. You're going to describe, and again, this is probably more of a mock or fictitious description, but yet still you need to describe your sample. Basically, your sample will be the number you have in each group, how many are in each group, the breakdown, males, females in each group, and the age mean for each group, and any other important factors or considerations you consider for the group, especially if the group demographics may somehow be implied in affecting the outcomes of the experiment. You may also then discuss certain external validity considerations, and that is the generalizability of the sample to the sampling frame and population as it's considered. So this is methods. Second part is the measurement section, and we spent some time in one of the exercises where you selected your measures for your experiment. I know that I also suggested in several of your measurement descriptions that you find yet other measures that can be used to limit or weed out or covary possible confounds. So talk about how the construct of the measure, how they're described, show appropriate citations for the measures, where they're used, how they're used, their basic construction, and most importantly, the measurement reliability and validity of the measure. This is especially important where in areas where you're attempting to measure a complex or a construct that is not readily definable. So in so doing, you must look at that measure and examine exactly how it's measuring that construct. What is it indeed that you are measuring? And again, you point out when you're looking at these measures and your research in general that you may very well be convinced and completely understand and comprehend the scope of your study and the constructs that you're measuring, but not everybody is. And because of that, you carry with you a certain amount of experimenter bias, and you try to remove that bias so that anybody who's looking at your study, especially people who have no experience with this particular, with whatever the particular subject matter is, or perhaps they even have somewhat of a negative bias toward your subject matter, that it is still very clear to that individual, and they can extract from that information from your study enough so that they know, oh yeah, that does make sense. This is truly uh, 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 a significant finding, to the point that it may even excite or induce somebody to then follow up on your study with additional studies and verify even more so, because you have to remember, no study, no experiment, none, is free from falsification. No study shows perfect cause and effect. And I mean, even the most scrupulously designed study in physics still doesn't show absolute perfect cause and effect. And in fact, that was discovered with the advent of quantum mechanics and quantum effects. But without even going into that, the thing that shows the greatest amount of validity in an idea, in an experiment, in a finding is not a single study, but multiple studies that seem to replicate and substantiate whatever the findings are. And the more replication that you have across time, across experimenters, across participants, and across cultures and ecologies. Those are the things that add strength to the theory. At this point, you don't have a theory. You have a hypothesis, and it is up to you to demonstrate that the hypothesis is valid based upon the statements that you're making. If you say that A causes B, demonstrate it, and demonstrate it through clear, measurable experimental evidence. Okay, so we're still in methods, and so the next part of that methods section includes the design and procedures. So in other words, what is your experimental design? Now, design is something that in this course we didn't delve into in great detail, but experimental design goes from the very weak type of experimental design, which would include case studies, single case studies, studies where somebody is describing a single individual, is describing a patient or change relative to the patient. And you have to realize that those are, although they are descriptive and qualitative and interesting, they're rife with bias and in many cases lacking any kind of empirical validation. This is the next area that you're looking at, and again, in this design, take it that although we didn't study all the different types of experimental designs, the purpose of a design is to establish a template by which you optimize your availability to resources and time, and at the same time optimize the or limit rather the threats from internal validity. And remember that you've got the exercise also examining threats to internal validity, and that's chapter 6. That's 5 and 6, indeed, relative to the design of an experiment, are at this stage of the game some of the most important. So remember that the threats to internal validity include history and regression bias, instrumentation, testing, attrition or mortality as we call it, maturation, and of course selection bias. So, but the key ingredients to a good design, without going into specifics, generally are a pre-test and a post-test. That is where the groups, the experimental group and the control group, and you may have other groups as well, other comparison groups, they're all measured by a single measure prior to the onset of the study, so that you know, generally speaking, that all of the groups are starting at about the same level. Let's say if you're doing a measure of depression, then all of your groups start at the same essential level of depression because you've randomized them, you've randomized the groups relative to assignment. Hence, the the key measures of both the independent and dependent variables should match the means of the single whole group prior to being assigned to the different groups. So, so randomization, pre-test, post-test. So now you've done a pre-test. Now the post-test is then going to demonstrate that indeed there was a change because you know that all the groups essentially started at the same point. So control group, pre-test, post-test, and randomization. The three key areas for a good experimental design. Looking at your internal validity, controls, in other words, threats, control the threats. How are you addressing these possible threats in the study? You may include other variables in there in order to filter out potential threats and confounds. And of course, demographic variables are important as well. Sex, age, socioeconomic status, level of education, perhaps even relationship status, whether the individual is single or is committed to is single but in a committed relationship, or is married, and so on and so forth. So look, this is really the essence of your study. Clearly, you're not getting results. So there's nothing to demonstrate. You're not going to show any results because you don't have any. All you're going to do is a proposal, and you're going to do the proposal using a PowerPoint medium. This is it. And then, of course, you're going to show your references. So these are all references listed in APA format. Now, what I want to also show you here, here's the guidelines right there. So I've got the guidelines, and the guidelines should also be posted on Canvas so that you can see them. It's the same thing that I've got here, but these same guidelines are in the syllabus that's posted on Canvas as well. So you can, this is where I've got this. In fact, I'm just looking at the syllabus. This is where these are. Now, the other thing I want to top this off with is an example of a pretty good presentation, PowerPoint presentation or proposal from a student in a previous class. And some of these constructs, like I said, are fairly difficult to operationalize. And of course, if something can't be operationalized, then it makes it almost impossible, if not impossible, to do a quantitative study or even a qualitative study for that matter. But so many of these things need to be operationalized. I know that some of you are dealing with some concepts that don't really have a lot of traction in certain scientific communities, and that's okay, especially if you can indeed demonstrate that the phenomenon is real and does exist and is measurable, and can describe the medium by which it propagates. Then, in fact, you may have something that you can then take to different research labs, because you may very well have discovered something that no one has discovered before. So I applaud any efforts in that area, but in order to claim that something exists or something happens, and you're going to do it via experiment, you must then describe or operationalize the medium by which it occurs. And if, let's say, that you are proposing that whatever occurs, let's say some sort of a synchronicity or augmentation between two people, how does that, or some sort of maybe a communication between two individuals that is not spoken, nor is there any other kind of known transmission. I'm just using this as an example. Then you might say, okay, if I can demonstrate that this occurs, that's certainly going to open a field for much more advancement and experimentation in this area. But in order to demonstrate that also, you need to demonstrate how it doesn't occur. For example, if it is electromagnetic, and it is a process of electromagnetic propagation or transmission, which hasn't been discovered or isn't obvious, then you'd also want to, in order to verify that it's electromagnetic, you might want to then put, let's say, a Faraday cage around each of the participants. A Faraday cage is a wire screen or mesh, usually made of copper, that filters out any electromagnetic interference going in or coming out. So if you don't get the same effect as you did outside the Faraday cage, then you know, it must be electromagnetic. So anyway, let's go. Here's an example of what I thought was a very good proposal in an area that is somewhat difficult to talk about, and her proposal was the effectiveness of biofield therapy, decrease of pain and anxiety, and the phenomenological experience of hospice patients. So one of the first issues that I would have reading this as simply a researcher, as a scientist, would be the construct of biofield. What is that? Now, most fields as we know them, are electromagnetic, or in other words, there's a field around a charge. It's an electric field. There's a magnetic field around a magnet. There's an electromagnetic propagation of all electromagnetic waves. That anything from the AC on their power outlets to the information going into and coming out of your smartphone, all electromagnetic waves. And there's quite a spectrum for electromagnetic waves. I would suggest perhaps that if you're looking in that area, you even familiarize yourself with the total electromagnetic spectrum, not just the visible spectrum, but the entire electromagnetic spectrum, going all the way from the very, very low end, in which we would see infrared and much, much lower than that, all the way to the extremely high end where we see X-rays, gamma rays, and highly energetic and quite harmful electromagnetic waves as well. Okay, so here she's talking about the biofield. I want to know what that is. And I know that this presenter knows what it is, but I want to know what it is. And I want to know what it is from a perspective of other than going to Google and looking it up. I need to know how is that composed, and if it is a field, then that field must emanate from some sort of a potential basis. Is the potential basis electrochemical? Is it purely electrical? What's the basis for that field? So this is something that really needs to be operationalized, but just using it in the title here is fine as long as we go into an operationalization of just what the heck is a biofield. And I don't mean, again, a basic, simple definition. I mean a definition relative to the factors associated with the thing, the energy, that if indeed it is such a thing, how does it emanate? What does the field looks like? All fields, in fact, have things called flux lines. What do the flux lines look like? How can I look at the flux lines of a biofield? Let's take a look at them. How can we design an instrument so that in fact we can transpose or transduce the biofield into something that is visibly apparent? So then this student goes into talking about the abstract. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but here she's got her abstract, and again, it's very good, although clearly it's 3 paragraphs. I'm sure this is more than 250 words, but that's fine. That's okay. I'm certainly not going to quibble over that. Then her hypothesis. Now she states her hypothesis before the literature review. That's okay. So she's hypothesizing higher scores of incidence of decreased pain for participants receiving biofield energy and decreased anxiety for participants receiving biofield therapy and phenomenology post-treatment related to transformative or transpersonal experiences. Again, these are interesting hypotheses. Some of these things have to be operationalized so that the reader outside of the field knows exactly what they are from an operationalized point of view. Like, what is a transpersonal experience? Then she goes into the literature review. Very good, very good, very good, and continues with an excellent literature review, talking about some of the topics uh, uh, where the idea of a biofield being used, or biofield therapy being used to reduce depression and anxiety and pain are indeed manipulated, so that the biofield, being the independent variable in this case, can affect the um, uh, described or felt subjective pain and or anxiety of the patient in the hospice. More on the literature review. More on the literature review. So again, this student really did a good job in the literature review department. Then she restates her hypotheses once again, and and here she's very specific in that decreased pain and anxiety will occur more among hospice patients who receives a 20 to 45 minute form of proximally practiced biofield therapy, treatments of 3 times a week. So she's very specific in this area. And then we go into the experimental groups. So this is really part of the methods section, and that is, how do we define those groups? Well, we have the biofield therapy group, we have a sham biofield therapy, and then a no treatment control group. Again, excellent as far as the setup is concerned. Then we do a sample selection. Sample selection, random number generator, not possible. Yeah, but we can use a random number generator. And perhaps, shoot, I lost it. Oh, here it is. And I think she's saying random number generator is not really possible here because we have to use quasi-convenient samples. So in other words, we really can't go around and select everybody who's in hospices and then assign them to randomly assign them to groups. So we probably have to be a little more sensitive than that, and account for whatever the lack of random assignment is going to be available. But right now, just that in and of itself, we could get dinged for a certain amount of weakness in the experimental result. But this is fine. Convenience samples are used quite often. She discusses her recruitment technique. And again, this is part because you have to discuss your a recruitment technique not only in a proposal, but then even in the final product. You would want to talk about that. She's talking about the exclusion criteria. She uses different exclusion criteria. Exclusion criteria, in fact, is really important as a control mechanism in your study as well. So now the exclusion criteria. Then she talks about external validity and measurement, still in methods, equalization of groups, systemization of sampling, talks about now the specific instruments for anxiety, measuring anxiety, the specific instruments for pain. Another study is the cognitive status for interviewability. So she's using the brief interview for mental status, and in fact, mental status scores exams are good. I perhaps wouldn't use a mental status exam because they're too biased, and they are also, they show not much sensitivity. So perhaps something else in line of establishing cognitive capability other than the mental status exam. Then a qualitative interview of the participant, if he or she is verbal, or if a family or staff if not verbal. And this is the so-called phenomenological experience. She makes a note, though, remember that this is a mixed methods study, and part of it is qualitative. Then she talks about her design. The design is a triple blind, participants, experimental 1, experimental 2, and the biofield therapist. Actually, it's double blind. Any of the experimenters or assistants in the experiment, no matter what their status, would be blind, and the participants are blind as well. So it'd be a double blind experiment. 3 groups, as you saw earlier. The scales used here and the data analysis then will come later. Let's see, then we move along, and now she's talking about the internal validity. Now remember, internal validity here includes the control groups, the differential history, maturation, attrition, statistical significance is very important as far as uh, um, uh, the validity of the results themselves. The power of the study is really related to the size of the groups, because group size is really important in establishing power. What is power? Power is the ability for you to be able to accept or reject the null hypothesis. What is the null hypothesis? If you are making any hypothesis whatsoever, which as you state in your introduction, you're stating your hypothesis that A causes B. That's your hypothesis. Now, power is a statistical characteristic that allows you the maximum capability or probability in being able to reject the null hypothesis, or in other words, say yes, there's a strong significance here, or probability, that indeed this experiment, my independent variable, did cause the change in the dependent variable. There's lots of power tables. This is something that I'm in fact impressed that she did address power in the study. It's something that you don't have to necessarily include in yours. This is why I'm showing you this study, because she's shown this. She's put together a study where some of the issues here are difficult at best to operationalize, and yet still I think she's done a fairly good job at doing it. Then she talks about institutional approval, going through an IRB, recruitment, assignment to groups, treatment procedures, pre and post tests on pain and anxiety, and phenomenological. Then she moves on into future directions for the study, which again aren't really necessary for your studies. Why? Because future directions really part of the discussion section of any paper. So you would have the abstract, the introduction, the methods section, the results section showing all of your analyses and tables and graphs and figures and what have you. And then after that, you then go into your discussion section where you discuss where your experiment perhaps faltered and where it was perhaps quite significant. In either case, whether you're jumping for joy at the results or downtrodden at the lack of results, either way, you need to discuss what happened and why you believe it happened. If it didn't work, that's fine. If it didn't show you the results, perhaps you could discuss that. Say, well, maybe it didn't work because of this or because of that. And these are under the headings of limitations and shortcomings. And so this is what she's discussing here, and that's future directions. Again, not really necessary for what you're doing, because you're doing a proposal. And future directions is really something that comes about after the experiment is all said and done. But this is good. Again, that's why I'm showing you this one, because I thought it was an excellent example of somewhat of an ideal. I don't believe in perfect, but in this case, it approaches the ideal for what you are aiming for. And then her references. And she goes into considerable amount of detail. Again, very impressive with the references. She's got an ample number of references. What you want to do when you look at the references, though, is look at the sources for them. So some sources may not be as efficacious as other sources. So let's say clinical gerontologists, that may be okay. Evidence-based complementary and alternative medicines is another one. Here's the one that comes from Palliative Medicine, Journal of Palliative Medicine. Interesting one, Journal of Death and Dying. Here's the International Journal of Transpersonal Studies, and so on. Let's go down to the last one, see what she's got. And notice it's in alphabetical order, of course. So here's one from another Journal of Hospice and Palliative Medicine. Here's one, Journal of Pain Symptom Management, so on. So these are things these are 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 reference sources that probably carry a considerable amount of weight. Here's the effectiveness of biofield therapies for decreasing symptoms of pain and anxiety and improving uh, quality of life. And here it says, what is the journal? Focus on alternative and complementary therapies. You might want to take a look at that, because in that, if they're talking about effectiveness of biofield therapies, I am sure hoping that they actually went into some detail regarding the operationalization of a biofield. So here's your references, and then she's done. And not only is she done, but actually I'm done as well. I hope that this little presentation helps you toward your goal. You all take care now.